A lady for Amberley. Sir Durin of Amberley gasped as another enemy arrow flew past his head, far too close for comfort. He screamed with anguish and rage when he saw that it had found a mark in the back of his squire, Crispin Blackwell. He dove to the young man's side and turned him over, but Crispin had already breathed his last breath in this world, and Durin would have to bring that news home to Widow Blackwell. Furious with grief, he turned in the direction of the arrow's path of flight. Those archers must be taken out. Perhaps if he could move toward the enemy's lines through the fray and then commandeer a stray horse, his own mount having fallen in the thick of the fighting, he might get near enough to debilitate the enemy archers. Duke Edmund Bracy fought with the strength of 3 lions. The men around him, when spared a second between saving their own lives and dispatching as many of the enemies as they could, shook their heads in admiration of the man's prowess and in gratitude that he was on their side. Then they saw a man tearing through the battle who fought like 5 wounded dragons. Sir Durin of Amberley saw the arrow seconds before it had almost reached its destined target. In those seconds he calculated the cost of Bracy's death to the wife of whom he spoke so often, to the family filled with children of which he was so proud, to his enormous estates filled with servants and vassals dependent on their lord for protection, not to mention the king, who would be sorely grieved at losing one of his titled defenders of the crown, versus the castle filled with only a few fairly independent servants that awaited Durin on his own return home, a return that would be made without Crispin, poor lad. Duke Edmund Bracy heard someone run behind him, recognized the heavy fall of a body against his back. He braced himself, thrusting with his sword at the enemy with whom he fought. He thus bought himself enough time to turn and cast this newcomer away from him, but when he saw who it was, he caught the young knight Durin, and they both fell to the ground. Durin's face was a ghastly pale, and wrenched with pain, his eyes closed against the world. Edmund, seeing the arrow protruding from the man's side, looked up and read what had happened in the faces of the surrounding knights. Many had paused in the fray, and now stared down at the pair in one of those curious lulls that can surround such a moment in the midst of battle. A roar of victory turned all their heads, and they saw the result of Durin's furious entry into this quarter of the battle. The enemy had been put to rout, and were now on a violent run. 1 week later, Sir Durin of Amberley awoke, slightly bewildered, to the fumbling prayers of a battle-hardened veteran sitting on the side of his bed. "Please God, he saved my life. What thou save is, he'll never want for family as long as mine goes on. I'll give him my eldest daughter to wed, and thus bind our houses." Durin moved weakly, hoping to make the man aware that his pleadings were not between him and heaven alone at this moment. "Durin, my lord? You're alive!" Heedless of the young man's nearly fatal wound, Duke Edmund Bracy threw his arms around Durin in a fierce embrace that left the invalid hiding a wince and muffling a groan. "Here, boy, drink this!" Bracy held a tumbler to Durin's lips, who gratefully drank before asking, "So, did we win?" Sir Durin of Amberley stood at the front of the chapel, and wondered if the walls actually were closing in on him, or if he was right to believe that such thoughts were the result of pure nerves. He also wondered if he was right to believe that he must have felt even less calm on the eve of his first battle. He really couldn't remember. He tended to forget all but the bare basics of moments when his entire body felt suffocated in tension, and now he found himself wondering what bare basics of this moment would endure in his memory. Duke Edmund Bracy proudly led his eldest daughter down the aisle to where his soon-to-be son-in-law stood so straight and tall and pale. Bless the lad. It was not even close to 6 months since that incredible turnaround battle, and less than a week since they'd left the ship and traveled inland. At last the boy would be able to fully regain his strength at home, with a wife to care for him. Edmund felt he was caring well for the life that had saved his own. How better for a man to repay his gratitude than to welcome his debtor into his family? It had never even dawned upon Edmund to consider that Durin might not want to marry his daughter. Sir Durin of Amberley, meanwhile, had never even allowed himself to consider whether or not he wanted to marry Bracy's daughter. He could think of a few things more dangerous than refusing to wed the daughter of a powerful, impetuously intense, and king-befriended duke that could be ably violent when the man thought necessary. But only a few things more dangerous. Sailing off the edge of the known world, for example, came to mind when contemplating the subject. Durin just hoped the girl wasn't like her warhorse of a father. Was it generally thought that girls usually take after their mother? Durin had no idea. Then again, did he want a wife as disinterestedly logical, emotionally detached, and self-strong and sufficient as Bracey's own, Durin having discerned these as Duchess Helen Bracey's gentler character traits from the stories her husband so adoringly shared? Durin didn't even care if the girl resembled her dark, rugged father or took after her mother's cool blonde looks. Could she just be a little soft in the heart? Could there just be a softness about her? Duchess Helen Bracey smiled rigidly, though sincerely. She did love a challenge completed in well-organized triumph. One letter from her husband with the marriage announcement and an estimated itinerary, and here they all were. A marriage in the Bracey Castle chapel on the day after the men returned home. Pity about all those storms that had prevented the planned earlier arrival. It would have been nice for the bride and groom to meet before the actual wedding, but obviously it was not to be. They couldn't have been introduced at the late hour the men had arrived yesterday, and inviting bad luck by letting them see each other before the ceremony today was out of the question. And an event like the marriage of Duke Bracey's daughter simply wasn't postponed, and thus fanatically necessary, like if a priest was unable to be found or something. A proxy for the groom could have even been managed. Anything before sending away the 100-odd guests that were already staying at the castle, and there was no chance of keeping them on indefinitely. Wasn't the castle beautifully decorated? Timid Maud Bracey walked slowly beside her father with a hand on his arm and a prayer in her heart. I thank thee, God, for using this man to save my father's life. I offer amenity in these proceedings as a token of my gratitude, while asking but 2 more mercies of thy gracious kindness. This man to whom I am to be a wife has shown that he is brave, strong, and fearless. May I be a little like him in these ways at this time, and may he please be just a little, if more than that would be too much, just a little kind. Sir Durin of Amberley watched his bride and her father approach. He watched the Duke step away and sit down by the Duchess. He saw the future Lady of Amberley walk up the steps to the altar in front of the priest. Bride and groom knelt with bowed heads in front of the altar, and the priest began his holy utterances. Durin stole a sideways look at the young woman beside him. Her hands, folded like his over the altar as if for prayer, twisted a little, her knuckles showing white. His heart tore ever so gently, and, unobtrusively, he turned his body very slightly to view her better. He sensed by her closeness to him how she quietly trembled as she tried to kneel so still and straight. He moved unnoticeably nearer in time to see a single tear fall into her hand from her pale, veiled cheek. So Durin of Amberley eyed the priest, whose face was raised to heaven. He listened to the holy man's deep voice resonating through the chapel. Assured that the only one who might see was far too preoccupied to notice, and that no one else would be able to hear, Durin leaned the smallest of leans toward his bride and whispered in the faintest tones he could manage, "Are you all right, my lady?" Maud Bracey's head raised very slightly and curved a little upwards to view Sir Durin of Amberley's face. She could barely make out his features through her veil, just as her own were almost indistinguishable to him. Had she just heard him whisper a question to her? A question of concern for her? Maud had never once in her life doubted that God always answered prayers, but a response in the affirmative still always left her a little gratefully awestruck. And then this answer had come so quickly. Maud blinked hard to keep further tears from spilling over as she tried to form a reply. The man was leaning in even a little nearer, but she felt no intimidation, only a loss for words, until she recalled how to answer in the positive. "Yes," she whispered back in a barely audible hush, and added wistfully, "Thank you." Sir Durin of Amberley felt a small wrench in his slightly torn heart at the possibility that this imperceptible interchange was concluded, and said, oh so softly, hoping that this whisper could express the tenderness he'd come to feel all of a gentle sudden for this young woman, "But you're trembling." Maud Bracey's heart, torn almost in two for months now from this completely unexpected, life-changing series of events, from nervous anticipation and from nearly overwhelming anxiety, gently constricted with a promise of sweet reclosure. Tears eased slowly down her cheeks, and she could not stop them. She tried to smooth her breathing enough to respond when Durin, unnoticeable to all else, carefully shifted himself still closer and eased his shoulder to touch hers. Her heart constricted again. His tore open a little more when she let her weight barely sink into his arm. It tore even a little more when she, in the sudden sweet perplexity that had befallen her, whispered almost out of his hearing, "I'm sorry. I fear I was a little afraid." She curved her head upwards in a small bit more, and he bent his a little further down. She still couldn't see his reception of this confidence that had required all her courage to share. He couldn't convey the final tearing that had fully opened his heart that his bride might enter in. Sir Durin of Amberley repeated her last words in his mind. She'd used past tense. Was a little afraid. It seemed to Durin that those sharp trembles, which were calming slowly away, indicated the word little might not be exclusively accurate. In fact, Durin feared it was sadly out of place, and the resultant kinship of their similar predicament in this situation warmed his soul and awakened all his protective instincts. Durin knew he participated in the wedding ceremony. He knew he rose and moved and spoke, but he could not have repeated a single word or act if asked to do so. Through the rest of the proceedings in the chapel, Durin was so entirely focused on the young lady beside him that all else seemed incapable of deserving his notice. Maud Bracey felt his close attention. She was grateful for such kindness, so touched that she braved turning to him fully when it came time for them to stand in front of the priest, tilting her head upwards to view his face as best as she could through the veil. Then it came time for the veil to be lifted. Durin wished it were not necessary for him to share his first glimpse of his bride's face with over 100 people whom he either did not know or barely knew, many of whom were probably well acquainted with the young woman and had seen her face many times. He envied those ones of the group, while he wished the whole of the gathering would disappear in its entirety. Maud Bracey's heart, made to rest easy by her new husband's concern and gentleness, now began to pound horribly beneath her ribs. She could feel her breath growing short, but she stood as tall before Durin as she could. She was suddenly aware that she had only thought she knew the fullest essence of fear at discovering she was to be married to a complete stranger. Now she was to see the face of that stranger, but that was not the cause of her growing even more afraid than before. Maud felt certain she could love anyone as kind as this Sir Durin of Amberley. She'd seen the faces of many warrior friends of her father, and she was prepared to take to her heart a face full of scars and weather-beaten as her father's. But her own face, what was this man expecting? He'd seen her mother, that striking blonde beauty. Could this man continue to be kind to a bride whose looks disappointed his hopes? Her husband's hands slowly reached toward the ends of Maud's veil and took hold of them. He paused a soft moment, and then carefully began to raise the fabric to look beneath. Maud's eyes widened. Her husband was a young man, younger at least than she had expected, and his hair was red? His eyes were large and green, and his face was so gentle. It was such a good face. Maud thought that she could lose herself staring into his face forever. She could look at those eyes forever, those eyes! And they were staring at her so deeply. If Maud had been able to read their expression, she wouldn't have suddenly bit her lip in worried consternation. But if she hadn't done that, Durin might have gone on gazing at his bride for the forever that had been in her thoughts. Durin had lifted his bride's veil to lay it back over her head, but once it uncovered her face, he stood like a man frozen. His eyes took in every detail of the anxious, hopeful young face before him, as if his own salvation depended on its memorization. He stared at the soft red curls that had escaped her head covering and that sweetly framed her innocent young face. Red curls? He would have smiled, but instead he lost himself in her sad blue eyes. He gazed at her pale, slightly blushing and very freckled cheeks, and the unprecedented thought came to him that he'd like to kiss each adorable freckle. He could feel his own face reddening at the very idea. He could barely take it all in. Those precious features were his own to look at for the rest of his life. Those eyes, so open, so gentle and trusting, they belonged to his bride? She was soft, more than a little. And there was more. There was a shading of a young fledgling wisdom in those eyes. She looked like someone Durin could talk to freely. She looked dear and loving, and God was good. Durin's own eyes filled with the look of a man so suddenly and surprisingly captivated that he is not entirely certain how to act next. As I said, if Maud could have read that look, the pounding that her ribs were taking from the inside would surely have ceased. But as I also said, she could not read the expression in the eyes of her husband, whom she so much wanted to please. So she bit her lip, and Durin came awake at the endearing, vulnerable action. Sir Durin of Amberley let his bride's veil fall over the back of her head. He took her newly ringed hand in both his own, raised it to his lips, and kissed it, gently, slowly, tenderly. His eyes connected with Maud's as he lowered his hands, still holding hers. Her face shone with wonder and a hope that was almost fully realized. Then he smiled, and her responding one was like morning mists parting for a noontime sun. Her smile lit up her face and charmed her husband even further as he led his bride down the steps from the altar and onward to the doors of the chapel. The end.